From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show. You know, just when it looked like things couldn't get any worse, I find out that Bill O'Reilly and Jenny McCarthy and I could all be out of work. That great corporate innovator Clear Channel Radio has invented talk show automation. I'm not kidding. People call the robot on any topic that they want and spout off to the machine about things that whatever there is on their mind. And then the machine catalogs and records this listener-generated content, the big buzzword. And then listeners sign up and they select what topics they want to hear, and the robot learns what you really like and feeds you only comments that you like. And voila, no more talk show hosts. How sad is that, huh? Well, while we're still here and employed, I remember sitting at one of those school board budget hearings a couple of years ago, the ones with all the PowerPoint screens, and talking with George Schmidt. He's a former teacher and journalist who works for a substance newspaper. He's been a critic of the budgeting process for decades. And he was just kind of sitting there and he said, oh, all this stuff about dipping into the reserves is the oldest trick in the book. And he predicted accurately that when that year's budget process was over, the board would just magically find millions and millions of reserve dollars that they denied existed just the day before. Well, only that's kind of the way things happened. You get a balanced budget, and we saw that again yesterday. Eric Zorn compiled a list of 9 CPS budgets and identified something around $750 million that has been pulled rabbit-like out of the CPS hat at the last minute. And don't even get us started on the central office reductions that we've called out so many times before on the show. So today, we have a balanced budget. The billion-dollar deficit dragon is slain, but what does it all mean? So on today's show, we decided to ask the CTU to come in and help us explain. Jackson Potter is staff, I forgot to ask you, staff coordinator,
That's
right?
Correct.
That's right, staff coordinator at the CTU. And I think we're going to have some interesting insights on this. And I also wanted to bring along our friend Mark Konkol from DNAInfo Chicago, who's been covering this stuff for a very long time and knows quite a bit about it. Mark, glad to have you back.
Thanks a lot, man. Good to be here.
So we should start at that magic moment yesterday when the CPS submitted to its board a so-called balanced budget. We had been hearing this thing about the billion-dollar deficit for a year, practically, an entire year, and suddenly we weren't hearing about it anymore. They came up with $620 million in one-time reserves, just out of nowhere, that didn't seem to exist the day before.
Right.
How do you explain this?
I mean, some of it is they're bonding out more debt so that they can meet their budget. A lot of it has to do with these massive cuts we're seeing in our schools. So countless neighborhood schools are going to eliminate their art, music, physical education programs. We're seeing librarians fired throughout the high schools. And we're going to probably see ballooning class sizes in the fall as a result of this so-called balanced budget. It's really being balanced on the backs of teachers and students. So I think that's, you know, an important point to note. They always have these chicken little scenarios. Every year it seems to be the constant, where they say and claim we have this billion-dollar deficit, and then voila, there's, you know, a huge infusion that magically appears. And so that's part of why you're seeing, you know, sort of from the right, the Tribune defending the board in saying, you know, people shouldn't call them liars, they really have a deficit. We wouldn't deny the fact that there is a legitimate deficit. There's a lack of investment in our schools, and that's a structural problem. But we would take issue with the contention that they've always been honest and above board. We know they're playing politics. We know their ultimate goal is to try and blow up our pensions and dismantle them. And so creating a crisis helps them do that.
Well, I can't help but draw this weird parallel that's utterly unrelated, but how we've heard in the past when, you know, the CTA gets in trouble and they've got to come up with some money, and they say we're going to have to close the red line. I mean, there's just nothing we can do. There's no way we can trim or anything else. We're just going to have to close the red line. That will take care of the budget. Right. And of course, everybody freaks out, and then that's a good way of managing the public to say, oh, they really need more money. So I guess they're kind of trying to play a kind of a ham-fisted version of that we have $1 billion deficit here, when in fact, It's a much more complex and nuanced issue that I guess they feel the public doesn't understand or want to take the time to understand.
Well, that's straight out of the playbook from the administration. I mean, we're going to close 400 schools. We're not going to close the high schools. We're going to close 150 schools, and then the final number is under 50.
Right.
I mean, the whole idea is get people really worried that the end is nigh and appear to make concessions so that while you're getting exactly what you want, you appear to be someone who's willing to listen and take suggestion.
And what you wanted was to close 50 schools. But you knew you couldn't do it if you just said we're going to close 50 schools.
I mean, that's what a cynic would say that.
Cynicism reigns at this table often, so we're not too worried about that. But so anyway, here's the thing that I really want to get some perspective on. Wendy Catton's group, raise your hand, has been going around talking to all the schools that will talk to her and collecting all this data, and their group has come up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 98, rounded off to $100 million in cuts. But yesterday the number that was floated was $68 million in cuts, and the press has pretty much gone with that number. Do you agree that that's how much has affected the classroom directly?
Part of the complication is they've imposed a new student-based budgeting process for determining a school budget. And what that's done is created a lot of losers and winners. So if you're a school that's seeing increases in enrollment, then you're going to get added per pupil expenditures from the district. If you're a school that's kind of streamlined and doesn't see a huge enrollment change, you're going to get cut. And if you're seeing a drop in enrollment, you're going to especially get cut. So that $68 million is really a fudged number. It's saying, okay, we're only cutting this amount from instruction, but what they're not saying is there's some deep, devastating cuts, like 23 positions being eliminated at Kelly High School, whole orchestra program eliminated, all the librarians losing their positions. There's no library that's going to be open in the high schools next year. So,
none in any high school?
Well, I mean, in most of the vast majority, I would argue, if these cuts are sustained. So, we're really skeptical of that number. If you look at the number of layoffs, 1,600 teachers is $160 million. So something's not quite right in their math.
That's kind of what I was thinking too. It's like you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 people have lost their jobs in the last year, and you're talking about 68 million. That the numbers don't add up there somehow. But but who knows?
We're not hearing of any cuts in the charter schools, for example. That's part of their budget too. So I think there's some smoke and mirrors that they're using to disguise redistributing a lot of resources into the charter networks.
Were you impressed with the $112 million that they cut out of the central administration?
Well, I mean, I don't even understand what that money is. Do you understand what that money is? I think some of it is money that they give to the central administration that trickles down. It usually trickles down into the schools. Yeah. And from the way people have explained it to me is the trickle down has stopped, and central administration is still getting their money. But better to answer that. I
mean, what Tim Cawley said and Peter Rogers, the chief financial officer, is, well, you can't just add up all the cuts that we've made to central office that we've claimed over the years, because I think that amounts to 3 times the budget of CPS or something crazy. Right. And it's impossible. So what they say is we use these estimates that are based on, the milk contracts that they have. They've been getting ripped off, according to CPS, so they renegotiated. Well, you got to take into account the inflation we would have had we not. So there's a lot of, I think, dishonesty in terms of how they're presented.
Well, I mean,
you can manipulate budgets and statistics any way you want. I mean, that's why I try not to get too bogged down on it. I mean, when I think about these budgets, I think about 2 things. I think about kids and employees and people who are losing their jobs, and really that's what it's about. Is student learning going to be affected? And then how many middle-class Chicagoans are going to be out of work because of, flatly mismanagement on the pension end? I mean, I started covering Chicago City Hall for the Daily Southtown in 1999. I think that first year is when I saw Mayor Daley roll out the big charts that said, here's where the pension is, and we're fine, and we need to rebuild all this stuff, so we're we're going to pay that off later.
We're going to take a little away from the pensions.
And you know, with the city hall budget, which I'm more familiar with than a school budget, is that every year the budget is, you know, 500 million or 600 million, and then magically the gap closes to 100 million, and then our taxes get raised. And it's part of, and maybe that's why Karen Lewis, you know, Snead says that Karen Lewis met Mayor Daley at Gibson's. Maybe she's trying to find out, you wrote the playbook, Mayor. Tell me how to beat it. He's bad-mouthing you all around town.
The August Chicago Sun-Times reporting today that they had a little tete-a-tete at Gibson's. Well, yeah, you know Karen Lewis. You see her every day. What were they talking about? Come on.
I mean, I don't know for sure. She didn't give me a blow-by-blow, but I can imagine that, you know, it's probably somewhat to do with his brother running for governor.
Oh, okay. All right.
And there's likely some talk about that this didn't need to happen. That, you know, you didn't need to have these massive cuts. There are alternatives. Some of the budget magic he's performed over the years, case in point. You know, so.
But there's nothing left to sell, so let's not get into that kind of magic.
Yeah, no doubt.
But at the budget hearing yesterday, Karen Lewis and the school board, you know, had a little back and forth with the school board president, and he asked her, you know, politely to stop calling them liars. And her reaction was priceless when she just kind of said, you know, and then walked away. I'm wondering, you know, do you consider them liars, or just, you know, people who do what they're told? I mean, what's the union's real perspective on that?
I mean, I think it sort of is a tricky thing, right? Because it's like I was saying, on the one hand, they're not lying about the fact that there's a structural deficit. They're just lying about what they need to do about it. You know, so for example, our state, we're one of the few states, we're an outlier, where our sales tax doesn't include services. Well, all kinds of money goes out the window. We're one of the few states, 7 in the country, that has a flat tax, that has no progressive qualities to it whatsoever. So the wealthy and their fancy lawyers pay less than we do. That's an outrage. But instead of saying any of that, or the TIF program where DePaul has a crappy team that they're going to give $100 million to for a stadium they don't need or deserve, you know, no, they're not talking about any of that. You know, and they're supposed to be the stewards of a system on behalf of children, the most vulnerable people in our society, in low-income communities that desperately need investment and security and stability in their lives, and they're wreaking havoc on that.
You know, one of the things that has always kind of occurred to me about this is that there is so much churn at CPS, not only in the top management, but the board. The board doesn't remain consistent for any length of time. So you have no institutional memory of any of this. So to these board members, the kind of things that they're seeing is all new to them. And then you have older and old guys like me who've been around for a while who, you know, I mean, I was covering Jane Byrne's budget in 1979. The same thing. Different board 20 superintendents ago, but yeah, I mean, it was exactly the same thing. We have no money to open the schools in September. And so there is no institutional memory. And if you have board members who believe that they were brought in to reform the system, and their playbook is being written by, you know, the same kind of, I would say, corporate interests, then they believe they're doing the right thing. I think they're decent and honest people trying to do the best they can. But the system is just kind of wired so that this playbook gets played over and over every single year. And I think you're right. It's like, when are we going to talk about the real issue, which is that Illinois is 48th in its funding of public education?
Right. And when Rahm points out at a press conference yesterday, you know, he points to the pension problem. And I asked him, is this Senator?
I saw that.
Is this Speaker Madigan's fault? I mean, whose fault is it?
Right.
And he kind of, you know, paused for a minute and changed the subject and said, there's plenty of blame to go all around, but it's just kind of like the old, you know, bar trick. You know, hey, what's over there? And I'm going to punch you in the face. I mean, if everybody's looking at Springfield and Springfield's to blame and they can't, and they're not going to get it done, then the hammer comes down on CPS.
Right. Now, and also, I've got a long list here of things I want to try to get out of this. I do not understand, there's a lot I don't understand about the way pensions are funded in Illinois, but we have learned in the last year, those of us who never knew this, that you guys at the CTU are funded differently from every other school board in the state of Illinois, suburban, downstate, and everything else, right?
Right. We get a penny on the dollar from the state as to what all the other teachers throughout the state get, even though I think we're somewhere near 20% of the teaching population in Illinois. And so it's a real unfair situation. We're also better funded than teacher retirement system. And what happens is the district pays for the significant contribution for employees and employer, and they've been doing that forever. 1895.
The Chicago Public Schools.
The Chicago
District.
Public Schools pays for it.
Yeah.
So, and we make an employee contribution, but at the rest of the state, they get paid directly by the state.
By the state of Illinois.
That's right.
Now, okay, this is the part that I don't understand. Mike Madigan and other leaders in the legislature want to change that. They want to use the CPS-CTU model for the rest of the state, which freaks out everybody in the state of Illinois because they've had this wonderful luxury of being able to just give people whatever they want because the state's going to pick up the tab. So, of course, and Mike Madigan and others were the people who helped them get there. So now all of a sudden they don't like it anymore and they want to get out of that. I think that's accurate. But now I'm hearing that the Chicago Public Schools, they did an interview the other day and said that they want to put themselves on the Senate Bill 1. Mark, do you understand this? No.
Absolutely not.
Okay, well that's fine.
That's why I ask
me feel
questions
better.
for a living. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, basically what they're doing is they want the same draconian plan for how to scale back on the pensions that they're trying to prescribe for the rest of the state.
So it's not that they want the same funding mechanism,
Right.
it's that they want the benefit of stripping the pensions, which is
right.
what the state legislature is now talking about doing to everybody else.
Reduce or eliminate cost of living adjustments, increase the retirement age, increase employee contributions. That's, sort of the set of things they're trying to do.
When it comes down to it, one of the things I'm really interested in is we know that government always does this. We know that, what their agenda is, but we also know that unions like the CTU typically get rolled over. I mean, what are you doing differently to fight that right now? What's the Karen Lewis-led CTU doing to
fight the pension attacks?
Just to fight pretty much all the attacks on public schools. I mean, besides having protests, how many protests can one guy go to?
Right.
And what good do they do? What's happening now?
Yeah, I do think, the power's in our membership. That, we're an elected body. We represent the 30,000 teachers who work and toil in Chicago every day and for a profession that they truly believe in. So I think to the extent that we're mobilizing, whether it's in the legislative arena, whether it's in the street, whether it's in our school communities, to help have ties with parents around issues that are affecting their children. Though that's our basic philosophy, that the major constituencies in the system deserve a say. So, we need an elected representative school board. It's an outrage. We see emergency management in Detroit and Benton Harbor, and basically, that's what our school system is in Chicago, North Chicago, East St. Louis. All the black, poor urban centers of the state are being stripped away in terms of their rights to have a say in these educational policies. So I think being an advocate for those kinds of things, taking a firm stand on the pension, not letting Ty Fainer and Rahm manipulate the scenario by lobbying Standards & Poor and Moody's to downgrade ratings and create this crisis, another shock doctrine maneuver on their part to convince people that there's no other choice. I think we have to build campaigns around things like a fair tax system. We have to build campaigns around TIF reform. We have to build some support around a hugely popular issue like elected school board. And that if you see some popular support coming out of the communities on that stuff, what's a politician to do? They're going to be forced at some point to
but
reckon with
people
that.
don't vote for policies, though. They vote for people. So does the CTU go after aldermen, state reps? Do you go after Madigan? Do you go after Rahm? Is there a plan for any of that?
I think that's what we have to change. It can't just be about personalities. It's got to be about substance. And so can these things become so much in the forefront of public consciousness that it alters the way people behave at the ballot box?
Well, if there's a takeaway from this half hour today that I want to get people to understand, it's that when you see the mayor and the school board saying the reason we are in this trouble is because of teacher pensions, back me up on this. I don't think that's necessarily true, because
wouldn't it be more correct to say that the issue is that government didn't pay their share of teacher pensions?
Exactly.
That's why we're in this position.
Do you guys think if they had, it would have averted all this crisis we're seeing?
No, I think that's part of a methodology to reform public schools, which really, I mean, frankly, don't really perform that well. I mean, Chicago, a lot of kids in Chicago already get a bad shake from bad schools for a variety of reasons, and it's not just teachers, or it's not just union members.
That's what makes this so multi-layered and complicated.
And I think that's why the mayor can be successful. He thinks he can be successful is people know the schools aren't performing, and he's seen as someone he portrays himself as someone who cares about these kids. He goes to visit them in class, and he cares about these kids, and he wants it better for them, and he's got to make the tough choice to fix it. And that is contrary to what the CTU's message is, which is this is not the way to fix it. And you're hurting middle class families, which hurts Chicago. I think that that's where the conflict is, and that's where it's going to stay.
Well, let me just have one more minute on this thing about the history, though. There was a time, and I don't know when it was, but in the mid-aughts, sometime to 03, 04, 05, when the CTU CPS pension fund was completely funded. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I mean, we were at 99%.
And so there was no danger that teachers were going to be going without pensions.
Right.
Now, of course, there is the mouse and the snake thing happening, and a lot of older teachers are coming out of the system now. But the thing that happened is that the state and the city lobbying the state were able to just take these so-called pension holidays, which have stripped hundreds of millions of dollars out of the pension system. So now today you get to say that the teacher pensions are adding $400 million into our budget deficit, but they're only adding it in there because it got taken out years ago.
That's right.
And I don't think that's understood by many people, and it becomes the number one arrow in the quiver when you want to demonize teachers as being the cause of this problem. It's really interesting to see what happened in Wisconsin, how they demonized the teachers, but yet the teachers were completely funded because they have their own totally independent, separate entity to fund the things. So there is a coordinated effort to try to make the teachers the source of this problem, which again is not to say that there aren't bad teachers and there isn't bad teaching going on, but it just seems to me like it's such a simplistic way of just a hammer when your only tool is a hammer kind of thing.
Well, this is kind of a flashpoint for our city. I mean, what we're talking about is school closings, and budget cuts happening all at the same time. So the school closings, a lot of the people who were up in arms were from, poor communities. They're mostly minority, and there's the likelihood that their kids were going to get sent from a school in one gang territory into a rival gang territory and become at risk. And there was outrage about it, but not as much as when the teachers went on strike, and because it only affected a small amount of people. I mean, a segment of the population, not a small amount. A segment of the population. Now, with budget cuts, what we have is we have it affecting everybody. Rich people, Whitney Young High School, the best places to work, best places to send your kids to school.
We should.
And the union. Some of your guys that I talk to say that the momentum is building in favor of a pro-teacher, pro-middle-class movement.
We should just mention, by the way, since we're on this topic, that you guys at DNAInfo Chicago.com have this amazing, I guess you'd call it interactive map showing the closed schools and tell us what you can find on it.
It just shows you Chicago has more than 600 gang factions. It's, you know, it fuels all the shootings and murders in the city. And when the map that we did for DNAInfo shows this school is in Latin King territory, and the school that they have to go to is now in Gangster Disciple territory. You know, there's a couple of good examples of that. There's, you know, there's West Pullman Elementary and Alex Haley Elementary, and West Pullman closed, and that was in Mayberry, which is controlled by a faction of the Gangster Disciples, and Alex Haley is in the Ville, and the Ville is a different gang. And these kids that who I've met and walked with, you know, can only go up to a certain block, 116th Street, and if they go across, they're afraid that there's a likelihood that a bullet will find them because there's gang feuds, and you know there's kids getting killed out there, and it's a really serious problem, and that, you know, that the mayor says they can tackle with safe passage, but we really don't understand how safe passage works.
And that
yet.
costs a lot of money too.
Yeah, and that's a concern for the teachers union as well. I mean, that's something that they bring up in a lot of their meetings that I've been to.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important, like these Jeremiads against public schools, like these are very much contested spaces for our society of, you know, what are we willing to invest in? What are our priorities? And since '83 Nation at Risk, we've been seeing there's been this attack that's consistent across both parties.
Yeah.
Where I taught at Englewood High School for 4.5 years, you know, we had 800 students, 16 security guards, 2 full-time police officers, a camera system that would circumnavigate the block. I came on board because the star basketball player was murdered on school grounds. Well, let's backtrack 50 years when Englewood became a primarily black community in the 1960s. Well, the guy I replaced was a student there. And they had 1 police officer who sat at the front desk as students went out for off-campus lunch. There was no metal detectors, and there were 3,000 students. It was known as the Castle. So what happened? Was it that all the teachers got crummy, or was it something else in the economy? The loss of steel, the loss of the stockyards, the loss of International Harvester and manufacturing that really undermined the economic viability of that area.
Right. And when you don't have that economic viability, then the schools fail, and you say, well, these schools are failing, so we have to close them. And then that creates another cycle of disinvestment.
It's like what Karen Lewis always says about her only meeting with Rahm Emanuel, that when they met, he allegedly told her, you know, 25% of these kids aren't going to make it, and I'm not going to invest in 25% of the kids.
Right.
And then go look at that map. I mean,
and there is your
and that's the argument that Karen Lewis makes.
Yeah.
You know,
Right. He's not going to ask his criminal friends on Wall Street to invest in communities and make sure children have a chance. He's going to move them out.
And that's where we're going to leave it, because we've only got about 15 seconds left, so we can't take on another topic. I'm really happy to have had this conversation today. Jackson, thank you so much for being with us. Jackson Potters from the Chicago Teachers Union, and our old friend Mark Konkol joining us from DNAInfo Chicago. Check out that interactive map. It's really worth seeing. And you can also check out this address anytime you want, because you can watch us right here on just get us online. But you can also see us, of course, anytime on CAN TV. So check us out there. Subscribe to us on iTunes, audio and video podcast. And we will see you right back here again next week with another show. We're going to be talking about ALEC next week. If you don't know who ALEC is, look him up, ALEC. See you next week on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks. Bye.